Continuing on from my story where I left off last time, which was about the death of my first wife. This would have been 1979. It precipitated a period of 2 years before I really recovered from that. And that cycle started off with being unable to be in the same room as more than one other person. So I ended up coming back to Ireland because that's a lot lower density population than was the case in England. It's also where I got sick and nearly died. I lost a lot of weight. It was the physical side of a nervous breakdown. But there was significant physical parts of that as well, which I don't really need to go into, other than to say this whole process, which lasted about 2 years, where my recovery was, where I was living for about 3 months in a cottage that a friend of mine had lent me in Donegal, which didn't have electricity or had running water, but that was all. It was about 2 kilometers from the nearest shop or village, so it was very isolated. But I was able to recover in that place. Looking back on it now, that whole period of 2 years, which was precipitated by the death of Aisha and was concluded by me waking up one morning and thinking, well, that's all over. It's time to get on with the rest of my life. But it makes me think about the role that that period of time and the pain and suffering that I experienced, what role that had in the development of my soul. And this is where we get into, I wouldn't say it's controversial, but counterintuitive. This is if you can give yourself a mind experiment for a while, say you're an immortal being, that you've been around forever, you don't know birth, you don't know death, you don't know suffering, you can have anything you want, your heart's desire, but you haven't got a heart and you don't have much in the way of desire. Just imagine what that life of the soul is when it's not incorporated in a body. It's a very different life. I've recently come to the conclusion that that's a life that we're aiming to get back to. I think traditionally it's called heaven. And I think it may be where stories happen. We have a story of heaven, but almost immediately you think of heaven as you think of a hell. And hell is a world of suffering. And I think at some level that actually describes this physical life that we have, where the soul gets incorporated with the body. I mean, most of our time that we're not suffering, actually, but we are sandwiched in times of suffering. we are born through suffering. It is a painful experience to go through the birth canal and to come out helpless and to be totally dependent on somebody else. At the other end of the scale, inevitably we will die. That's 100% certain, and I'm not saying that it is a painful process, but it's certainly one which is often associated with suffering. The process of one's life is also, when you think about growing up, I particularly remember things like the teenage years where you're struggling with hormones and new things and expectations, and it's a big, mad zoo of forces which nobody can really help you with. You just have to experience it and find your way through. And inevitably, that is involved suffering of some sort or another. You may have high points of enjoying it, but it's the lack of, it's the things that you need to learn in the process. You don't come out pre-programmed with how to cope with finding your place in the world. There are high points, there are joys, but we develop bonds with people, we develop bonds with our parents. They're there, they're cemented into our being. And it is a normal situation that we witness or we have to be around the death of our parents. Sometimes it's the other way around, but more commonly it is to do with anything to do with the death of a close loved one involves some measure of suffering, because at some level, on a soul basis, we are connected to them and they're connected to us, and then that connection is broken, and that breaking of that connection is experienced in some way or another, whether it's grief or other kind of suffering. So I think this is, at one level, I'm not saying this is the only reason that we come here, but it's one of the reasons, one of the things that is a characteristic of our life with the body is for the soul to experience suffering. And joys and suffering come together. You've experienced joy and the security of joining with other human beings. But there are necessarily pain and suffering when that comes to an end, and it inevitably comes to an end. We come into this world actually alone, and we leave the world actually alone. And in the process, we have bonds formed and broken. So this is this looking back on it in this period, this 2-year period. Although it was suffering, what is at the bottom of it is the one is very sensitive. Something has been stripped away, and the experience of life becomes very intense to the point that I at least had the feeling that I needed to be alone in order to experience this or recover from this difficulties with grief and coming to terms with a new life. This is something that I've been now very aware of. That life is split. Our life is split up into bits, sections, and almost they're completely different. This period that I'm talking about represents the end of that life that I had with my first wife. When you join with somebody, when you get married to somebody, when you make a commitment to that other person, you join with that soul. And the life that you live is a new life. It's not your own life. It's a life with another person. So this becomes, when this other person leaves, this is the end of that process. This end of that life. So I come to the conclusion, this is one of the times in one life, but we'll call it a little death, where the life that you have led comes to an end. And it's a process. It's a process of assimilation. I think it's a combination. The soul requires the body to heal. The body requires the soul to grow. And it's a process. I can remember when I finally woke up in that cottage in Sleevely Cottage near Killybegs in Donegal. I woke up one morning and thought, it's over. I've done this. Time to get on with my life. So I went from one extreme, which was to be in the most remote of remote places, in Donegal, to realizing it's time to get on with my life, and that whole feeling of being sensitive just gone. And I felt it's time to get back and trying to go to London. So that really put a full stop at the end of that chapter and opened up the next chapter, which is like a new life, which I'll talk about on another occasion. Thank you.